Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 187. And this time I'm going to talk about Joe Higgs' magnificent album from 1975 on Micron Records, Life of Contradiction. And what I've got here is a 1976 release on Micron's a Jamaican label. This is actually on Gronation, which is one of the labels that emerged from the collapse of Trojan Records, that classic reggae label in the early 1970s. And Gronation, of course, is named after Gronation Day, which is the day that Haile Selassie visited Jamaica, April 21st, 1966. This is one of the great reggae records. There's no flash, there's no hype, there's no overproduction. It's just top-notch tunes sung by their composer, who has got probably more reggae cred than almost anybody in Jamaica, and he's backed by an absolutely top-notch band. Joe Higgs is born the 3rd of June 1940 in Kingston, Jamaica. He goes on to be a major figure in the development of Jamaican popular music, in particular reggae music, in the 1960s and 1970s, despite his relative anonymity these days. Higgs was one of the very first singers to emerge from the Trenchtown area of Kingston, and as he came up, he ended up mentoring all kinds of other young singers along the way, including a young Bob Marley, whom he was working with as early as 1959. Bob and Bunny Livingston ended up meeting Peter Tosh through one of Higgs's lessons. He taught the three of them to harmonize, and he also introduced them to Cox and Dodd, the Jamaican recording guru, in 1963. Dodd would, of course, go on to produce many of the Wailers' early hits. Marley gave a lot of credit to Higgs for their early development, and he was still part of the scene 10 years later when the Wailers had had a bit of success, were about to tour the States, but Bunny said he didn't want to tour, didn't want part of that whole scene, so Higgs steps in to play with the Wailers on that tour. His path and the Wailers' path also intersects around the song Stepping Razor, which Higgs wrote in 1967. Tosh then subsequently recorded later in the 70s and never gave Higgs credit. Higgs eventually won a court case, but never saw a penny. And while he was instrumental in the careers of the Wailers, his mentorship didn't stop there. He was a key to the early development of Jimmy Cliff, Judy Mowat, Derek Harriott, and the Wailing Souls. In the 1950s, which was not only pre-reggae, it was pre-rocksteady and pre-ska, Jamaica as a whole was fascinated with the R&B sound coming out of the southern U.S. Higgs' first foray as an R&B songwriter and singer occurs in 1958, when along with his collaborator Roy Wilson, he records a track called Manny O, a track which was produced by none other than Edward Seaga, who of course would go on to become Jamaican Prime Minister. And Higgs and Wilson's career as a duo continues with a modest degree of success until 1964, when Wilson decides to emigrate to the States, and that ends that. Higgs continued to work with a solo artist, but his natural tendency toward collaboration led him to work with a lot of other players, and those included Carlos Malcolm and the Afro-Jamaican Rhythms, Lynn Tate's Soul Brothers Band, and Jimmy Cliff. He toured frequently with Cliff in the late 1960s, and in that time he was honing his talents as a songwriter. He wrote a number of songs for Cliff, and he continued to release his own singles. He gets a bit of a boost in early 1972 when he enters a song in a Jamaican tourist board song competition called Invitation to Jamaica, wins that, and his increased profile leads to Chris Blackwell of Island Records offering him a record deal. That, of course, leads to this record, which I'll get to in a second. It's important, however, I think, to understand the key role of Higgs, not just in the musical development of reggae, but also the lyrical development, because as one of the very first folks to come out of Trenchtown, he was one of the very first people to bring real political and social consciousness to popular music in Jamaica. Both ska and particularly rocksteady had been very focused on, at least lyrically, been influenced by Motown, R&B, very much Boy Meets Girl, Moon, June Spoon kind of stuff. Roots reggae and the kind of lyrical content that people like Higgs were producing was much more focused on the situation in ghettos, the reality, particularly for Black Jamaicans, of continued depression despite the false dawn of political independence and so on. And so the roots reggae and the highly social and political content we've come to expect in the 1970s out of that is very much grounded in the contributions of Higgs early on and very much evident here. Of course, like a lot of outspoken people, no good deed goes unpunished, and his 1983 single So It Go, which was kind of critical of the Jamaican government of the day, led to him getting harassed significantly, and he ends up having to move to the States, and he lives in Los Angeles from 1983 onwards. This record has a bit of a fraught history because it's recorded in 1972, but not actually released until 75. The main issue is that Blackwell felt that he really couldn't market Higgs, that he was a bit more of a folk singer, his message was political. In Blackwell's words, he's fantastic, but he's a problem image-wise to promote. So the record is made, and it sits, and it sits, and it sits, and Higgs is getting a regular paycheck, but he's getting very frustrated at the fact this is not getting released. He could basically see the label is totally focusing on Bob Marley, and of course, the focus on Bob Marley had also pissed off Tosh and Bunny Wailer, who had gone their separate ways as well, and Blackwell is not held in esteem by a lot of that crowd, although it's a complicated story. Eventually, Blackwell concedes to Higgs he's never going to feel the time is right to release the record, gives Higgs the rights. Higgs then takes the rights to Michael Johnston, who is the founder of Micron Records in Jamaica, and they release it in 1975. Johnston is also the producer of this record, and it's kind of fascinating because he only produces 2 LPs in his whole career, and both are excellent. This one and also Negril, which is a Peter Tosh project from 1975. The lineup, of course, includes Joe Higgs on vocals and rhythm guitar. He also writes all the songs. Val Douglas on bass, Michael Richards on drums, Earl Lindo on piano. Mikey Chung provides a second rhythm guitar, but they needed a lead guitarist, or as Higgs said to Blackwell, I need someone who can provide guitar decoration. So Blackwell calls up some of his contacts in the States, and the guy they get is Eric Gale. It's kind of a funny name to introduce here because Gale is best known as a routine session player for Creed Taylor's Kudu Records, and he's on all kinds of fantastic jazz funk dates in the early 70s, including a lot of work by Grover Washington Jr. Gale comes in here and does some great work, but initially it wasn't smooth sailing in these sessions. As Higgs says, Eric didn't like the reggae because he thought it was too slow and it was boring. He was trying all the time to change things, and I said, fuck no, you can't do that. When it was eventually released, the reviews were positive, although ironically some of them said, geez, this sounds kind of dated, which of course it was, but it stood the test of time. The production in particular is very satisfying. It's dry, it's bass heavy, there are almost no frills or solos, it just has this hypnotic, rich groove almost all the way through. Side 1 starts with Come On Home, which has this unusually foreboding intro for a reggae tune. It's got this memorable descending line in the chorus. Higgs isn't really what you'd call a gifted singer, but it's hard to think of anybody who sings with more emotion, and so he's really compelling because of that. He actually sounds vocally quite a lot like Peter Tosh, or maybe I should say Tosh sounds like him because who's the master and who's the teacher. But he does have a much greater facility, I think, than Tosh does on more sentimental tracks. He's good in the political stuff, of course, but much more in tune, I think, emotionally when it's required. Got to Make a Way is about taking responsibility for your own freedom and your own community and not just being a fair-weather rebel. It's got this tremendous, tremendous bass riff which drives the tune. The third song on side 1, Wake Up and Live, is a fantastic song, and it's also remarkable how tightly linked this is to the Wailers sound of the same era and how influential clearly he was on Bob Marley. This could easily have been a Wailers song. It's sentimental, it's optimistic, it just has that kind of special sauce. Now we're on to the title track, Life of Contradiction, which is a masterful piece of songwriting. You have soul rhythms that are kind of interspersed with reggae rhythms. It's a very complex structure and melody, not overly complex, but just clearly a master of the art. And the vocal and the piano introduction are pure McCartney. The last track on side 1, Who Brought Down the Curtains, is a great song about a cheating lover, which begins as if it's the most wicked Temptations track ever. Phenomenal album side, just amazing. Side 2 starts with There's a Reward, which is a fascinating track. It's sung from the perspective of someone who's leading a life on the run, basically a fugitive from the law, but it's very kind of reflective about the singer's own shortcomings and sort of looking back on his life and the circumstance in which he finds himself. Anyway, very subtle, nuanced lyric. Hard Times Don't Bother Me is another strong track. It's got some great acoustic work, I presume by Eric Gale. My Baby Still Loves Me is another song which could easily have been a Marley tune, especially the guitar melody. For the most part in this record, the production, as I mentioned, is very uncomplicated, kind of like a Burning Spear record. But there is a degree of complexity in the next track, She Was the One. The last track, Song My Enemy Sings, is maybe the quirkiest track in the record. It's still very good. It has almost kind of a doo-wop melody. In fact, you can imagine reproducing this whole record with doo-wop production. The melodies and the vocals, in many cases, would fit. And that's kind of funny considering the fire and brimstone nature of the lyrics. This is all about final reckoning and God striking down one's enemies and so on. As I mentioned at the start, this is a superb record. Amazing songwriting, minimal production, great delivery, lots and lots and lots of melodic hooks. Given the overall parsimony of the approach, if there is a complaint, although I think there are lots of good efforts at variety on this record, by the end of 10 songs you may feel as if there's a little bit of sameness in the sound. But to be clear, and probably because this is a songwriter's album, not only are there no weak tracks, there aren't even any mediocre ones. Its sound is unique and distinct from the great mass of 1970s roots reggae albums. It occupies a space somewhere between politically conscious reggae and lovers rock. I would say it's very much a must-have in any serious reggae collection, and I would give it 4.5 out of 5 stars.